I'm the festival stage manager at the Utah Shakespeare Festival, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about calling a show. Today I'm going to focus on calling straight plays. While general principles are the same, musicals are slightly different. I don't have a whole lot of time today, so I'm not really going to touch on those differences very much. A lot of the general information is the same, but I'm not going to get into the specifics of that. I also want to preface all of this by saying this is the way that I call shows. This is the way I do things. Every stage manager is different. The needs of every show are different. So as with all things stage managerial, make sure you're doing it in a way that makes sense to you. That's the most important thing. So what does it mean to call a show? Basically, that means that you're making sure that all the various technical elements are working together at the right time, in the right order, and that everything is safe. So you've been through a rehearsal process. You've learned how the show should run from the director, from the actors, from the designers, and from your own experience and knowledge, right? And you've worked up a ton of different kinds of paperwork to help you figure all of that stuff out and to keep it all straight. And now you're going to go into technical rehearsals and you're going to use all of that information to help you put the show together. And you're going to start having to call the show for the first time. So calling a show is basically made up of calling a series of cues of various kinds. The stage manager is usually the person responsible for calling all of the cues in the show while other people execute those cues. So what is a cue? A cue of any kind, lights, sound, scene shift, actor entrance, is something that makes a particular event happen. It makes the lights change, it makes the scenery move, it makes the fog start and stop, that sort of thing. Every cue is made up of several parts, primarily 3 parts. So the first is what I call the label, which is often abbreviated, and that is the name of the kind of cue that it is. So a light cue or a sound cue. And then the number helps you keep those cues straight. So that lights 12 is different from lights 22. The second part of the cue is the trigger, or the action or line that the stage manager is watching or listening for in order to activate the cue, that things that makes you want to tell people that it's time for that cue to happen. And then the activation is the third thing, and that's the stage manager saying go, which is what you usually say is the word go, and that is what tells your team to make that cue happen. So label, trigger, activation, the 3 parts of a cue. So where do you get cues from? How do you know what the cues are? Some of them come from other folks. In fact, probably most of them will come from other folks, the designers especially. But the stage manager also has to figure out certain cues on their own or with their team, particularly those of like scene shifts or cueing actor entrances and things like that. And you'll learn those throughout the rehearsal process and make notes about them and then start to finesse them when you get into technical rehearsals. So how do designers give you cues? There's a variety of ways. They can have a meeting with you and you can write things down as they talk, or they might give you their script with their notes in it that you then can make a copy of for yourself and transfer into your own script. But the way that I mostly get cues here at Utah Shakespeare Festival is I get cue sheets. I get paperwork from designers. And this is an example of one of those cue sheets. This is the lighting cue sheet that I got from Jamie Smith, who was the lighting designer for a production of Othello that we did a few years ago. So on this sheet, you can see that she's giving me the cue number, the page number that the cue happens on, the time of the cue, how long it takes to happen, the type of the cue, which in this case is a location of that the cue, that the lights are. IB stands for inner below. The action or the line, which is what she thinks is the trigger for the cue, and then the intent of the cue, what she wants the cue to do or what the cue is doing. And we'll talk about intent more in a second. So all of this information helps me to figure out where to put the cue in my script. If I know, for example, that cue 25 wants to be up, the lights want to be up when Brabantio is visible in the doorway and the cue takes 4 seconds to execute. All of that information is here on this sheet. I can figure out how to call it 4 seconds before he arrives. And the sound and other cue sheets often work in a very similar way. So the next step, once you've got all of your paperwork with all of your cues from your designers and your shift plot that you've created and all of that information, you want to gather that all together. And again, everybody does it slightly differently. But what I think is really important is, if possible, you should try to find some time to put your cues into your script or your book before your first technical rehearsal. Text can be crazy high energy, high pressure, and you want to make sure that you've had a chance to sit somewhere quietly and write everything in your script very carefully and thoughtfully in a way that makes sense and is legible. So you're not trying in the frenzy of that pressure cooker that is tech to figure all of that out in the moment. I also like to make sure when I'm first putting cues in my book that I'm doing it very lightly in pencil or maybe even on a Post-it note so that I can easily erase them without completely chewing through the paper on my script page. But once you're through tech, you can make them much, and you figured it all out, you can make them much more solid. I still keep mine in pencil. I just write darker. I never leave Post-it notes, cues on Post-it notes in my script because I'm afraid I'm going to lose them. They're going to fall out. But the general idea that you should keep in mind when you're putting cues in your script is that you should be able to call the show about the same way every time, and that if something happens to you, somebody else could pick up your script and do a pretty decent job of calling it in your absence. That's why it should be clear and detailed and consistent. So the way you write your cues should be consistent from sequence to sequence, and things should be specific, especially notating where the triggers are. It should be really specific, because if I don't know the show as well as you do and I have to come in an emergency and call it, I need specific information to help me. We talked a little bit about intention on the cue sheet, but I think intention is the most important thing to understand about a cue. So when does the director or the designer want to see that cue happen? When does the actor need to walk through the door? What order do those scenery pieces need to move in to make it smooth? Does the designer want the lights to happen as the actor crosses or once they get to where they're stopping? Once you understand the intention of a cue, and if you know the show really well, which you will by this point, you can then figure out where to call the cue, where to activate that trigger, and to make it accomplish that intention. If you do that, then the show never becomes robotic. As the show changes through a run, which it will do, or if something weird happens in performance, somebody drops a line or somebody trips and falls, you can alter where you have to call the cue without losing the intention of the cue. And being flexible that way, you're the only one probably who is ever going to know that something weird happened or that something was different from normal. Calling a show is not a mechanical activity. It's not just, saying a bunch of words and then the word go after them. It's a very artistic endeavor. You have to understand the show. You have to breathe with the show as it flows and changes from performance to performance. So this is an example of one of my scripts. This is from a production of Charlie's Aunt. And because I'm right-handed, I put my blocking notes on the right and my script on the left, and I leave myself a really big margin on the left to put my cues in. So, I always do that. At the top of the page, you can see this little S with the circle in it, with the circle around it. That's my standby. Normally, this is on a little yellow Post-it note. You'll see that easier a little bit later. But I tell my board operators and crew about a half a page before I'm going to call the cue to stand by for the next cue sequence. It's usually not just one at a time. It's usually more than one at a time. But this does a couple of things. Ideally, when you stand by a cue, your operators should look at their board and make sure that the next cues you're going to call are the next ones in the stack on their computer. And if they're not, they need to let you know. They should have their finger near the go button on the board so they're ready to push it as soon as you say the word. You may also want to have your operators and your crew respond to you or acknowledge your standby verbally in some way so that you know that they heard it. They can say lights or sound or rail or whatever seems appropriate to you. Some stage managers also give warnings as well as standbys. Those are usually a little ahead of a standby, so a couple of pages ahead. I only do that for big scene shifts. Otherwise, I'm talking all the time and it can get confusing. So if I do a warning for a big scene shift, I do it 2 or 3 pages ahead of where that shift is going to happen. That way that gives the crew plenty of time to get to where they need to be and get ready to go. Lower down on the page, you can see the abbreviations I use for different kinds of cues. So the SQ is sound cue, the LQ is light cue. Here I have a little note to myself to remind myself that light cue 36 is a blackout. So what I do, if the script is, if the trigger is a line of dialogue, I take a ruler and draw a line through to the appropriate place in that line of dialogue where I'm going to say the word go. And if it's between words or at the end of a word, I use this little arrow, which is also called a caret, C-A-R-E-T, to indicate that that's where the go happens. Sometimes I'm specific on a word. I say the go on a word or on a syllable of a word, and in which case I would put a box around that word or that syllable. I use this eyeballs icon here and the note underneath it. This tells me that this is a visual cue, meaning that I'm watching for a particular moment of action that's either without dialogue or that the designer wants it to happen on the action and not the word. And this tells me the combination, this reminds me that it's a visual cue, and then the note tells me what it is that I'm watching or listening for. So this is another example of a script of mine. This is a much more complicated show. This was a version of Christmas Carol that I did about 15 years ago. So you can see I've been doing this the same way for quite a long time. Here you see the box around the word, and the same thing here, or the caret at the end of the line. These little arrows here are just a reminder to myself that this group of cues is quickly followed by the next one. It just means keep talking, don't stop talking. Up here on the top right, you can see this note to myself. I kept wanting to call this music cue, this scene shift cue too early. And so I wrote myself a big old note to make sure that I didn't do that. These are a couple of other scripts from other stage managers. These stage managers use color-coded stickers. In this case, this sort of peachy color is lights and the green is sound. And then the blue ones are miscellaneous. This one is a cue light and this one is a verbal cue to lock the lift. And this stage manager over here is a different stage manager. They also use a color-coded system, but they basically do it the same way. So these are methods that work visually for them. These cues went in on the stickers after everything was set, because once you put a sticker in, it's hard to move it around. So this was done after tech. So to call a show, I'm watching a lot of things at the same time. I'm watching the show on stage. I'm watching any monitors I have. I'm watching the script. So it can be a little bit confusing sometimes, and sometimes, especially early on in a run of a show, you can't lift your face up out of the book. You have to read your cues to get them right. That's okay. It takes time. But if there's something dangerous happening on stage, or you feel like there's something somebody needs to keep an eye on and you can't do it because you're calling cues, then have somebody backstage keep an eye on it for you. So when I am calling cues, I try to develop a rhythm so that my board ops can get used to how I do things. And I try to keep doing it the same way every time, so that they have a rhythm as well. It takes some practice, but the idea is that don't call your standbys too early or too late. Like I said, I do it about a half a page ahead. If you're too early, your board ops or your crew or somebody may stop paying attention, may stop listening. If it's too late and there's a problem and like the next cue is not what you think it should be, you may not have time to fix it. Then I do when a cue is coming up, when I'm about to call it, I do what I call prepping the cue, which is basically saying the abbreviation and the number of the cue. So that's the prep. I try to keep the amount of time between the prep and the go the same for every cue. This isn't always possible. Some sequences are tighter than others, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. Give yourself enough time to get all of the prep out clearly and accurately, and then have enough quiet time or silence at the end of the prep so that you can hear or see the cue in the clear. When you say go, say it as a statement, go, not as a question, go, because that doesn't help your board ops. They need a definitive word to be able to know to push the button. Only say go when you mean it during a performance. If you are talking about something, talking about a cue, and you say go, somebody may take a cue. If you ever want to talk about it, just spell it. So for example, if I were going to tell my board op that I want them to do something weird or different because something's happened, after I say the cue, after I trigger the cue, um, I would say to them, after I say GO, please do this, because somebody else may not be paying close attention. And if I say, after I say go, they may think it's their go. So never actually say go unless you mean it. The other big thing to keep in mind when you're prepping and calling cues is anticipation. So remember, it takes a fraction of a second for your op to process that you've said go and then to hit the go button, or for your crew to process that you've said it and then overcome the inertia of something that has to move. So you need to anticipate by that fraction of a second. For example, if there is a blackout at the end of a music that happens on the last note of a song, say, and that blackout's on a 0 count, so it happens fast. You have to say go just a fraction before that last note so that the darkness occurs on the last note. If you wait to say go until the last note, your blackout's going to be a little bit late. You will eventually figure out, especially after working with the same board op for a while, how long it takes them to react to your go, and then you can adjust your calling that way. I always tell my board ops, wait for my go. Even if you think I'm wrong, or if you think I've missed something, because you know the show now as well as I do, wait for me to say it. There may be something that I've seen that you didn't notice, something bad may have happened, or there may be some other reason why I've decided to change it in that moment. I would rather take the blame for being wrong than have somebody accidentally get injured because not everybody was seeing what I was seeing or paying attention. So then we get to tech, and the cast has had several weeks of rehearsal to learn their lines and blocking, and tech is yours and your crew's time to learn their tracks. Ask for the time you need. If you need to do a tricky sequence multiple times, ask to do so. You cannot be expected to get it all right the first time you try it. And safety is also a big thing to be mindful of in tech. I always explain to my casting crew what's going to happen before it happens, especially if it involves big pieces of moving scenery or anything else that has the potential for injury. If, for example, if you can walk through a transition in light first and then add lights in work light and then add the lights and sound. Have the actors make their blackout exits in full light the first time. Ask them if they need glow tape or a flashlight off stage to feel safe, and make sure there's nothing in their way of the path of their exit. And then you can do it in the dark. If you do these kinds of things and your cast and crew sees that you're thinking ahead, it will make them feel like you're on top of things, because you are. And it will help them have confidence in you, and it will give you confidence in yourself. So in a minute, I'm going to play you a short video that's an example of me calling a sequence from a show. It's from a production we did here at USF of Henry V back in 2016. But I want to talk first about cue lights. So sometimes there's no dialogue in a scene. It's a fight scene or a dance number, or it's just a moment of physical action. And it's hard for the actors or crew to see or hear what's happening on stage. So I need to cue them visually somehow backstage. So we use cue lights to do that. And cue lights can also help you if there's a moment where you have a lot of prep to say. If you've got lights and sound and scene shifts and automation and all kinds of things happening at once, you can use cue lights for some of it and prep the rest of it, and that way you don't have to talk so much. So the photo on the right is a cue light. This is a little Christmas light. This is at the Engelstad Theater. They're all over the back of the theater, in the theater itself and in the front of house. And the photo on the left is the board that runs them. This is a little mini light board. So when I want to use a cue light, I push the slider up, which turns the light on. On means stand by. So the person knows to be looking at the cue light, because we've talked about that in tech. And the on is to tell them to stand by. When the cue happens, when the trigger happens, to activate a cue light, you turn it off. That's the go. You can use multiple lights at the same time to cue people in different locations, which is also really handy. You can see all the different locations are labeled here on the control panel. So these are the pages from my script from the sequence that I'm going to call. So here you can see the yellow Post-its for my standbys. QL means Q light. I tell myself that here I'm turning it on, which is a standby, and these are the ones I'm turning on. Later you'll see I have Q light off and then which one I'm turning off. Unfortunately, you won't see me using Q lights in the video because they're not set up at the moment. Again, cues are grouped together around a single line that happen together, that are called together. And then here's the caret and here's the box that indicates what the trigger is. Since there was no space for the fight in the script itself, I had to add some blank pages into my book to write on. You should always feel free to do that if you need more space. This is the first added page. So over here, these are the cues, right? This is what that is cueing. So this is the action that I'm cueing. And then this over here on the far right is the trigger. This is what I'm watching or listening for in order to know when to activate the cue. So lights 143, sound 169, and these cue lights happen after 2 sets of arrows. You'll see that in the video, and they're cueing on the flag bearers. And that's how it works through the sequence. At the bottom here, Game of Thrones, that's the nickname we gave to this section of the fight. The actors come on in a clump. They couldn't even see a cue light. So I cued my ASM, and she cued them verbally backstage. And this is the final page of that sequence. And this is just basically more of the same. So I am going to stop sharing this screen for a moment so that I can share the other screen with you. Sorry. And now I'm going to play you this video.
There's not a piece of feather in our camp that our fly. The time hath worn us into slovenry, but by the mass, our hearts are in the trim. And my poor soldiers tell me yet ere night they'll be in fresher robes, or they will pluck the gay new coats or the French soldiers' heads and turn them out of service.
Standby lights 141 through 144, sound 164 through 178, fog, and Game of Thrones.
Herald, save thou thy labor. Come thou no more for ransom. Gentle herald, they shall have none, I swear. But these, my joints, which if they have as I will leave them, shall yield them little. So tell the constable.
I shall, King Harry. And so
lights 141
well.
And sound
None
164.
shalt hear herald anymore.
Go. Trap fog.
Once more come again for a ransom.
Go.
My lord, most humbly on my knee I beg the leading of the vanguard.
Take it. Brave your...
Lights 142, sound 166, and inner below fog.
And how thou pleaseth God, dispose the day.
Go. Sound 168. Go. Lights 143 and sound 169. Go. Lights 143.2 and sound 170. Go. Sound 172. Go. Sound 174 at Game of Thrones. Go. Sound 176. Go. Lights 144, sound 178, and less fog. Go. So that was wasn't a particularly complicated sequence, although it's hard to watch the fight to make sure everybody's staying safe and to call the cues at the same time. You'll also notice I got a little lazy. A lot of those were visual cues, but I didn't write my little eyeball symbol to make that happen. So let me see if I can get back to my slides here. Sorry. There we go. So the last thing I want to share with you is if you're interested in watching more examples of a stage manager calling a show, this is a really cool thing from the Royal Opera in England. A few years ago, they did a project where they filmed a production of Valkyrie with 17 different cameras. One of them is trained on the stage manager, and you can also follow along in their book and watch and listen to them call the show. This is the website for the link for that website. And I would highly recommend, if you're interested in this kind of thing, to check it out. Plus, opera is different from theater, even from musicals. So it's an interesting thing to see how that works. So that's pretty much it for today about calling a show. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this webinar.